I've watched it happen more times than I can count. Two men, same confidence at the start, same certainty in their voice, same ability to lead. One keeps control of his life and his relationship. The other slowly loses himself decision by decision until he's asking permission to exist. This doesn't happen because one man is cruel and the other is kind. It doesn't happen because one woman is submissive and the other is difficult. It happens because one man understands something most men never see. Until it's too late, power in relationships is never given. It is taken, tested, and enforced quietly. The most dangerous moment isn't when a relationship is falling apart. It's when everything looks fine on the surface, but the frame has already shifted. When love starts to feel like negotiation, when peace costs you your authority, when compromise slowly becomes surrender. If you've ever felt that shift but couldn't explain it, this story will make it clear. Stay with me. Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if these conversations matter to you, subscribe. Calmly, intentionally. I didn't understand power when I first entered a serious relationship. I thought confidence was enough. I thought attraction, once established, sustained itself. I believed love was a partnership between equals built on compromise, empathy, and shared decision-making. That belief felt mature. It sounded reasonable. It was also the beginning of my mistake. At the start, everything was clear. I made the plans. I chose the places. I decided how my time was spent and what mattered to me. She followed without resistance, not because I demanded it, but because leadership was already present. It was natural. I wasn't trying to impress her. I wasn't managing her emotions. I was simply living my life, and she stepped into it. That was the attraction. What I didn't realize then was that attraction isn't created by effort. It's created by structure, by direction, by a man who knows where he's going and moves there without asking for permission. Somewhere along the way, that structure began to soften. Not through one dramatic argument or a clear turning point, but through small, almost invisible decisions. A canceled plan to avoid tension, a changed opinion to keep things smooth, a quiet apology for something that hadn't actually violated my values. Each moment felt insignificant. Each one seemed reasonable on its own. Together they formed a pattern. I began to believe that being a good man meant being flexible, that caring meant accommodating, that love meant making her happy even when it came at the cost of my own certainty. I didn't see it as weakness. I saw it as growth. I told myself I was evolving beyond ego. In reality, I was surrendering frame. Frame is not confidence. Confidence is emotional. Frame is structural. It's the authority that defines what the relationship is, where it's going, and what is acceptable within it. It answers questions before they're asked. Who leads? Who decides? What matters? What doesn't? At the beginning, I held that frame without thinking about it. Later, I gave it away, deliberately believing that equality would strengthen the bond. I was wrong. The first sign wasn't conflict. It was hesitation. I started checking in before making decisions that used to be automatic. Where I once acted, I now consulted. Where I once chose, I now negotiated. Slowly, my internal compass began to reference her emotional state instead of my own judgment. She didn't demand this shift. That's the part most men misunderstand. There was no direct request for control, no ultimatum, no declaration of authority. The change happened because I allowed my fear of conflict to override my commitment to myself. Each time I adjusted my behavior to avoid discomfort, I taught her something. not through words, but through precedent. I taught her that pressure worked, that my boundaries were flexible, that my leadership was conditional, and once someone learns that you can be moved, you will be moved. I still thought we were equals. I still believed the relationship was fair. But fairness is irrelevant in power dynamics. Someone was setting the terms, and it wasn't me anymore. Decisions about social plans, spending priorities, even what counted as appropriate behavior, slowly shifted out of my hands. I didn't notice the change because it felt gradual. It felt cooperative. It felt loving. That's the trap. Power rarely announces itself. It accumulates, quietly, through repetition. I began to feel something I couldn't name at first. A subtle tension. A sense that I was no longer acting freely, that I was managing reactions instead of making choices. I would replay conversations in my head, anticipating what would upset her, adjusting my words in advance. That's when I understood something was wrong. I wasn't leading anymore. I was asking permission without asking. The most disturbing part was recognizing myself in a role I had always rejected. A man who needed approval to live his own life. Not overtly, not dramatically, but functionally. I remembered who I was at the beginning. Decisive, grounded, unapologetic. And I saw the distance between that man and who I had become. The distance wasn't created by her, it was created by my own choices. I had believed that surrendering control would make her feel secure. What it actually did was shift the entire dynamic. Authority doesn't disappear when you give it up. It transfers. And once transferred, it reshapes the relationship, whether you like it or not. The irony is that none of this felt malicious. It felt normal. It felt like what good men are told to do. Be understanding. Be accommodating. Be patient. Be selfless. No one tells you that selflessness without structure becomes submission. I started to realize that every relationship operates within a frame, whether acknowledged or not. Someone defines reality. Someone sets direction. Someone establishes limits. When that role is unclear, tension fills the gap. Attraction doesn't survive ambiguity. When I stopped leading, she didn't become happier. She became more restless, more critical, more uncertain. The more I tried to please, the more unstable the dynamic became. I mistook that instability for emotional complexity. In truth, it was a response to lost structure. What I was experiencing wasn't unique. I saw it in other men. Friends who used to be decisive now deferred. Men who once moved freely now negotiated their existence. All of us started in the same place. Confident, grounded, respected. The difference wasn't luck. It wasn't personality. It was understanding. Most men are never taught that relationships are not sustained by quality. They are sustained by leadership, not domination, not cruelty. Leadership. Clear direction that removes uncertainty and provides stability. I had abandoned that role, believing it was the moral thing to do. By the time I recognized what was happening, the precedent was already set. And reversing precedent is harder than establishing it. Power once given away is rarely returned voluntarily. This was only the beginning of the pattern. What followed was more deliberate, more psychological, and far more damaging than I expected. Once the frame began to weaken, the pressure didn't increase all at once. It intensified in layers. Subtle at first, almost polite. Each layer designed to see how much resistance remained. At the beginning, it came through emotion, not anger, not confrontation, disappointment. A quiet shift in tone, a heaviness in the room that suggested I had done something wrong, even when nothing concrete had been said. I would ask what was wrong. She would say nothing, or she would say she was just tired. But the tension stayed. I learned quickly that the tension disappeared when I adjusted myself. If I canceled my plans, if I changed my priorities, if I softened my position, the atmosphere improved, peace returned. And I mistook that relief for resolution. It wasn't resolution, it was conditioning. I began to associate my independence with emotional discomfort and my compliance with calm. That association rewired my behavior faster than any argument ever could. I didn't need to be told what to do. I started doing it automatically. This was the first stage. Pity. She didn't accuse me. She positioned herself as hurt, as neglected, as secondary to my choices. The implication was always the same. If I truly cared, I would choose differently. If I loved her, I would sacrifice. And because I still believed love meant prioritizing her emotions, I responded exactly as expected. I reassured. I adjusted. I gave ground. Each time I felt a small internal resistance, a sense that I was betraying something important. I ignored it. I told myself that relationships required sacrifice, that this was maturity. What I didn't see was that sacrifice without limits doesn't create closeness. It creates imbalance. When pity stopped working consistently, the tone changed. Now, it wasn't about feelings. It was about character. She began framing my decisions as evidence of moral failure. A good partner wouldn't act this way. A real man would want to make his woman happy. Other men didn't have these problems. Maybe I wasn't ready for commitment. This was shame. Shame doesn't argue with your logic. It attacks your identity. It forces you to defend who you are rather than what you chose. And when a man starts defending his worth instead of standing on it, the battle is already lost. I felt the pressure immediately. Not externally, but internally. A tightening, a need to prove myself, to show that I wasn't selfish, that I was capable of being what she needed. So I compromised again and again. Each compromise reinforced the same lesson, that my judgment was negotiable, that my boundaries were temporary, that persistence would eventually break me. I didn't see these stages as manipulation. That's important. There was no villain in my mind, no malicious intent. It felt organic, emotional, human. But effectiveness doesn't require intent. Patterns work whether they're conscious or not. When pity and shame stopped producing immediate compliance, the final stage appeared. Anger, not explosive anger, not yelling, not chaos. This was colder, more controlled. Withdrawal, distance, silence. Affection removed without explanation. Threats implied, but rarely spoken directly. I would feel the absence immediately. The room felt empty even when we were together. Conversations became functional. Physical closeness disappeared. The message was unmistakable. Something was wrong, and it was my fault. This kind of anger doesn't demand obedience. It creates an environment where obedience feels like the only way to restore normalcy. I began modifying my behavior preemptively. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted the tension to stop. Because peace felt better than standing firm. That was the moment I understood how power actually moves in relationships. It doesn't arrive through force. It arrives through your willingness to surrender comfort in exchange for control. I started to notice a pattern. Every time I held my position, the pressure increased. Every time I gave in, the pressure vanished. The lesson was being reinforced daily. I also noticed something else. Her respect wasn't increasing. Her satisfaction wasn't deepening. The more I accommodated, the more demands appeared. The goalposts moved constantly. What I thought was emotional complexity was actually escalation. The most unsettling realization came when I asked myself a simple question. If I were to suddenly reclaim my authority, would it feel natural or disruptive? The answer terrified me. It would feel disruptive. That meant authority no longer belonged to me. By that point, I had trained both of us. I had trained her to expect compliance. I had trained myself to avoid resistance. The dynamic was no longer about love or understanding. It was about control and comfort. I began to recognize this pattern in other men. Conversations that started with jokes about keeping the peace. Men laughing about asking permission, men shrinking their lives slowly and calling it compromise. None of them were weak. That's the mistake. They were conscientious, emotionally aware, invested, and those traits without structure made them vulnerable. What made this dynamic so powerful was that it aligned perfectly with my own values. I wanted to be a good man, a supportive partner. I wanted harmony. I didn't want unnecessary conflict. And that desire was used against me. I also began to understand why the early phase of the relationship felt so different. Back then, I wasn't trying to manage her emotions. I wasn't negotiating my existence. I wasn't afraid of losing her. I had nothing to protect, so I acted freely. Once I became emotionally invested, fear entered the equation. Fear of loss, fear of abandonment, fear of being seen as inadequate. Fear is the lever that moves power. The more afraid you are to lose someone, the more leverage they have over you. Not because they want it, but because the dynamic demands it. I thought love would protect me from this. It didn't. Love intensified it. The deeper my attachment grew, the harder it became to say no. The harder it became to disappoint. The harder it became to stand alone. That's when I realized the truth most men never hear. The moment you prioritize keeping the relationship over maintaining your integrity, the relationship is already over. It just hasn't collapsed yet. What I was experiencing wasn't cruelty. It wasn't betrayal. It was a test. And I was failing it repeatedly. Every time I chose peace over principle, I taught her that my strength was conditional. And conditional strength isn't strength at all. This was no longer about individual arguments or isolated disagreements. It was about precedent, about what my behavior had proven over time. I had proven that pressure worked, and once that lesson is learned, it is used. What came next wasn't accidental. It was inevitable. Once pressure becomes predictable, it stops feeling personal. It becomes procedural. That was the shift I failed to notice until it was complete. The arguments no longer sounded emotional. They sounded strategic, not in words, but in timing. Issues surfaced when my priorities conflicted with hers. Tension appeared when I moved independently. Calm returned when I adjusted. The pattern was consistent enough that I could predict outcomes before decisions were even made. That should have been my warning. Instead of asking why the same conflicts kept repeating, I focused on managing their effects. I tried to soften conversations. I tried to anticipate reactions. I tried to preempt disagreement. Each attempt pushed me further from leadership and deeper into compliance. I began to live inside her emotional weather. If she was calm, I felt relief. If she was distant, I felt anxiety. My internal state became reactive rather than self-directed. I wasn't making choices anymore. I was calculating risk. That's when I lost authority completely. Authority cannot coexist with fear. The moment your decisions are governed by the desire to avoid emotional consequences, you are no longer leading. You are negotiating survival. I remember the first time I noticed she was making decisions without consulting me. Social plans arranged, financial assumptions made, commitments agreed to on my behalf. At first, I told myself it was convenience, efficiency, trust. But the truth was simpler. She didn't feel the need to ask. People don't seek permission from those they don't recognize as authorities. I also noticed that my objections were treated differently. Where they once carried weight, they now required justification. I had to explain myself, defend my reasoning, prove my position was valid. She didn't. Her preferences were self-evident. Mine were questionable. That asymmetry is the clearest indicator of lost frame. When one person's desires are assumed legitimate by default, and the other's must be earned through explanation, I told myself this was just how relationships evolve. That initial intensity fades and practical reality takes over. That leadership naturally becomes shared. But shared leadership only works when both people respect the structure. What we had wasn't shared, it was transferred. And transferred authority doesn't stabilize, it expands. Each time she made a decision unilaterally, and I accepted it, the precedent strengthened. Each time I protested weakly and then complied, the message became clearer. Resistance was optional, compliance was expected. I also began to notice something else. Her tone changed when she spoke to me. Less curiosity, more correction. Less admiration, more evaluation. I was being managed. That realization hurt more than the arguments ever did, because it meant the dynamic had reversed completely. I wasn't leading a relationship. I was being supervised inside one. The most uncomfortable truth was that this supervision felt justified. I had taught her to step in. I had created the vacuum she filled. Authority doesn't disappear when abandoned. It relocates to whoever is willing to hold it. And she was willing. Not because she wanted control for its own sake, but because instability is intolerable. Someone had to decide. Someone had to set boundaries. And I had stepped back. The more she assumed control, the less attracted she became. That paradox confused me at first. I thought leadership from her would reduce tension. Instead, it intensified it. She became more critical, more demanding, more dissatisfied. This is where most men break psychologically. They see a woman who is getting everything she wants and still seems unhappy. They assume they're failing harder, that they need to give more, try more, sacrifice more. That's the worst possible response. When someone gains power over you, they don't feel safer. They feel burdened. They didn't want to lead you. They wanted to follow someone stronger than themselves. By surrendering, I had forced her into a role she resented. She didn't lose attraction because I was kind. She lost attraction because I was controllable. This was the moment I began to understand something fundamental. Power in relationships isn't about domination. It's about who needs whom more. The person who needs less controls more. And I needed her far more than she needed me. My happiness had become dependent. My sense of stability tied to her approval. My confidence contingent on her mood. That imbalance was visible whether spoken or not. People sense dependence instinctively, and dependence invites control. I started replaying the early days of the relationship in my mind. The way she looked at me then, the way she responded to decisiveness, the way she relaxed when I led without explanation. Nothing about her had changed. I had become careful, accommodating, predictable. And predictability, when it replaces strength, kills desire. I realized that I had crossed a line that most men cross without noticing. I had made her the center of my emotional world, my primary source of validation, my main reference point for meaning. Once that happens, power is no longer negotiable. It's lost. You cannot lead someone you're afraid to lose, and you cannot be respected by someone whose approval you need to function. The tragedy is that this process doesn't feel like collapse. It feels like stability, like settling in, like maturity. But it's not growth. It's erosion. I wasn't being attacked. I was being tested. And every test I failed made the next one harsher. By this point, the relationship was no longer balanced. It was structured around my compliance and her evaluation, around my fear and her authority. And once that structure is established, everything else follows naturally. What came next wasn't a surprise. It was the consequence. By the time I understood what was happening, the dynamic was no longer subtle. It had hardened into something fixed, not dramatic, not loud, just settled. Decisions now flowed in one direction. Expectations moved the same way. When tension appeared, the assumption was automatic. I was the one who needed to adjust. I was the variable. She was the constant. That realization didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as clarity, cold, precise, uncomfortable. I saw how predictable I had become, how easily my behavior could be influenced by emotional pressure, how quickly I moved to explain myself when challenged, how often I tried to justify decisions that never required justification before. That's when I understood the real cost of my earlier compromises. They hadn't solved problems. They had established rules. Rules I never agreed to consciously, but followed anyway. Every time I gave in to avoid conflict, I taught her what worked. Every time I apologized without believing I was wrong, I weakened my position. Every time I sacrificed my priorities to maintain harmony, I confirmed that my needs ranked lower. Precedent is stronger than intention. Once a pattern exists, people act within it, without thinking. She didn't need to push as hard anymore. The system was already built. I self-corrected before pressure was even applied. That's the most dangerous stage of control, when enforcement becomes unnecessary. I started noticing how quickly I would feel guilt. Guilt for wanting time alone. Guilt for choosing my friends. Guilt for saying no. The guilt wasn't imposed. It was internalized. That's when authority is complete. I also noticed something else. My own resentment was growing, quietly, beneath the surface. I didn't express it because I had trained myself not to. But it was there. Every compromise left residue. Every swallowed objection added weight. Resentment doesn't disappear when ignored. It accumulates. At the same time, her dissatisfaction increased. She was getting more of what she wanted, yet seemed less content. The more I complied, the more restless she became. The more predictable I was, the more she pushed. That contradiction finally forced me to stop lying to myself. This wasn't about her happiness. It was about structure. She wasn't testing me because she wanted control. She was testing me because she needed to know whether there was anything solid left to lean on, whether the man she chose still existed. And my responses were answering that question clearly. I was failing. The hardest truth was accepting that she didn't respect me less because I was cruel or neglectful. She respected me less because I was pliable, because my boundaries moved under pressure, because my principles adjusted to her emotions. People don't respect what they can bend easily. I had confused empathy with obedience. I thought understanding someone's feelings required surrendering my judgment. I was wrong. Empathy acknowledges emotion. Authority decides action. I had abandoned that distinction completely. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction revealed the same pattern. She would push, I would explain. She would resist, I would soften. Eventually, I would comply. And each cycle reinforced the hierarchy. The moment of truth came when I imagined the relationship without me adjusting, without me conceding, without me smoothing edges. The image felt almost impossible. Not because she would leave immediately, but because the structure itself would collapse. That's when I understood how deep the imbalance had become. A relationship that depends on one person's constant surrender to function is already broken. It just hasn't ended yet. I also understood why this happens to so many men. We are taught to believe that love is self-sacrifice, that leadership is selfish, that authority is dangerous. So we give it up willingly, believing we are doing the right thing. No one warns us that surrendering leadership doesn't eliminate power struggles. It guarantees we lose them. Power doesn't vanish when ignored. It defaults to whoever is willing to hold it. I saw now why men who maintain control aren't harsher or less loving. They are simply less afraid. Less afraid of displeasing, less afraid of loss, less afraid of standing alone. Their independence protects their authority. Mine was gone. The most painful realization was that she didn't become the authority because she wanted to dominate. She became the authority because I abdicated, because someone had to. And once someone is forced into leadership over a partner, attraction doesn't survive. Desire doesn't grow toward weakness. Respect doesn't attach to compliance. This is the point where most relationships die quietly, not through betrayal or explosion, but through erosion, through a gradual reversal where one person leads reluctantly and the other follows resentfully. By now, I was no longer confused. I was sober. I could see the road ahead clearly. Continue as I was and become more managed, more diminished, more invisible. Or reclaim what I had given away, knowing it would create resistance. That's the choice most men avoid until it's too late. Because reclaiming authority doesn't feel loving. It feels confrontational. It feels risky. It threatens the fragile peace built on surrender. But peace without respect is not peace. It's delay, and delay only makes the reckoning worse. What most men don't understand is that the real collapse doesn't happen during arguments. It happens during the moments of silence afterward, when behavior adjusts and no one names what changed. That's where authority is either reclaimed or buried permanently. By this point, I could feel the weight of every decision before making it, not because the decisions were difficult, but because the consequences had been conditioned into me. I knew exactly which choices would create tension and which would restore calm. That knowledge didn't empower me. It trapped me. I had learned how to avoid discomfort, not how to lead. That distinction matters more than anything else. Leadership accepts discomfort as a cost. Submission treats discomfort as a threat. And I had begun treating emotional discomfort as something that must be eliminated immediately, even if it meant eliminating myself in the process. I started asking a different question. Not how to fix the relationship, but when exactly I stopped respecting myself inside it. The answer was uncomfortable because it wasn't one moment. It was many. Small ones. Repeated ones. Moments where I knew what I wanted and chose not to say it. Moments where I felt resistance and suppressed it. Moments where I compromised, not because I believed in the compromise, but because I didn't want the consequences. Those moments shaped everything that followed. The deeper issue wasn't her behavior. It was my fear. Fear of conflict, fear of being alone, fear of being seen as inadequate, fear of losing access to affection and validation. Fear makes leadership impossible. A man who is afraid cannot hold frame because frame requires the willingness to accept loss, not recklessly, not dramatically, but calmly. When I was honest with myself, I saw that I had built my life around the relationship instead of building a relationship around my life. My purpose had narrowed. My world had shrunk. My sense of meaning had become conditional. That made me predictable. Predictability is safety for systems, but death for attraction. I also noticed how my internal dialogue had changed. I no longer asked, "What do I think is right?" I asked, "How will this land?" That question alone revealed everything. My judgment had been outsourced. Once judgment is outsourced, authority follows. This is where most men confuse kindness with weakness. They believe that holding firm means being cruel, that saying no means invalidating feelings, that leadership requires emotional detachment. None of that is true. Leadership requires separation. Separation between empathy and responsibility. I can understand your emotions without allowing them to dictate my actions. I can care about your experience without surrendering my direction. I had collapsed those boundaries completely. Every emotional reaction from her felt like feedback on my worth. If she was upset, I assumed I had failed. If she was distant, I assumed I needed to repair something. That assumption alone gave her total leverage, whether she wanted it or not. I also began to see why the testing never stopped. Because it couldn't. Each time I held my ground briefly and then gave in later, I reinforced uncertainty. Intermittent resistance, followed by compliance, is the fastest way to invite more pressure. Consistency ends tests. Inconsistency multiplies them. She wasn't pushing because she enjoyed conflict. She was pushing because the structure was unstable. Because sometimes my boundaries held and sometimes they collapsed. Because she never knew which version of me she would get. That uncertainty demanded constant verification. I realized then that most men don't lose control all at once. They lose it intermittently. And that's worse. Because intermittent strength teaches others to keep testing. The hardest part of this realization was accepting that restoring authority wouldn't feel smooth. It wouldn't feel loving. It wouldn't be met with immediate relief. It would create friction, resistance, possibly loss. And that's why most men never do it. They choose the certainty of slow erosion over the risk of decisive correction. But erosion is still loss, just delayed. I began to understand a principle that changes everything. The person who is more willing to walk away controls the relationship. Not because they want to leave, but because they can. That willingness isn't verbal. It's embodied. It shows up in posture, tone, timing, and decisions. It shows up in what you tolerate and what you don't. At this stage, I had none of it. My fear of loss was visible. Invisible fear invites control. I also saw why appeals to fairness never work in this context. Power dynamics don't respond to logic. They respond to behavior. I could explain myself perfectly and still lose authority if my actions contradicted my words. And they did. Every time I said something mattered to me, but abandoned it under pressure, I disqualified myself as a leader. Every time I claimed a boundary and then softened it to keep peace, I erased it. Boundaries are only real when enforced. I stopped blaming her entirely at this point. Not because she was blameless, but because blame was irrelevant. The structure existed because I allowed it to exist, and only I could change it. The question wasn't whether reclaiming frame would upset her. It would. The question was whether continuing to live without it was acceptable. I already knew the answer. The relationship had become a mirror reflecting back everything I refused to confront in myself. My avoidance, my dependency, my fear of standing alone. And no amount of accommodation was going to fix that. What I didn't know yet was how severe the resistance would be once I stopped playing my role, or how revealing that resistance would become. That came next. The moment I stopped adjusting automatically, the system reacted, not emotionally, structurally. Small decisions that used to pass unnoticed suddenly became points of friction, not because they were unreasonable, but because they broke expectation. I said no without explanation. I made plans and didn't negotiate them. I chose my priorities and let the consequences exist. The resistance was immediate. At first, it was confusion. Questions framed as concern. Are you okay? You seem different. Is something wrong? The tone suggested worry, but the function was verification. Was this change real or temporary? I didn't explain. Explanation invites negotiation. Negotiation invites erosion. When confusion didn't restore the old pattern, the pressure escalated. Emotional reactions returned sharper this time. Disappointment resurfaced heavier than before. The implication was clear. This version of me was creating instability. I was disrupting the balance. But the balance had already been false. What I noticed immediately was how uncomfortable the silence became when I didn't move to resolve it. I had spent months, maybe years, smoothing tension reflexively. Now I let it sit. I didn't punish, I didn't withdraw, I simply didn't fix. That alone changed everything. Emotional pressure only works when someone is invested in immediate relief. The moment I stopped treating discomfort as an emergency, its power weakened. Not disappeared, weakened. She tried shame next, subtle at first. Comments about how relationships require compromise, about how people grow together, not apart, about how this wasn't who I used to be. That last one was accurate. I wasn't who I used to be. I was closer. Shame only works when identity is fragile. When I stopped defending myself, it had nothing to attach to. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I acknowledged her feelings without changing my position. That distinction mattered more than anything I said. Then came anger. Not explosive, measured, controlled. Withdrawal returned, but this time it was sharper. Less affectionate, more distant. The atmosphere felt conditional again. I recognized it immediately. This was the final test. In the past, this is where I would have folded, where I would have restored peace by surrendering ground. This time I didn't. Not aggressively, not defiantly, calmly. I continued living my life. The effect was unsettling, not just for her, for me. For the first time in a long time, my internal state wasn't dependent on her reaction. I felt tension, but it didn't dictate my behavior. I felt discomfort, but it didn't control my decisions. That's what authority feels like. Not dominance. Independence. And independence is what pressure can't penetrate. What happened next surprised me. The anger didn't escalate indefinitely. It peaked. Then it stalled. Without reinforcement, it had nowhere to go. Pressure requires response. Without it, pressure dissipates. This is where most men misinterpret what they're seeing. They think resistance means they're doing something wrong. In reality, resistance means change is happening. Every system pushes back when its rules are altered. I also noticed something subtle but important. her respect began to return in small ways. Not verbally, behaviorally. Fewer tests, less correction, more attention to what I said instead of how I said it. Respect doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through compliance without pressure. The irony was painful. The more willing I became to lose the relationship, the more stable it became. Not because I threatened to leave, but because I no longer acted from fear of loss. Fear had been the fuel all along. I realized then why so many men get stuck. Reclaiming authority requires enduring a period of increased conflict, and that conflict feels like regression, like failure, like destruction. But it isn't. It's rebalancing. You can't renegotiate power quietly. Power only shifts when behavior changes consistently under pressure. What also became clear was that reclaiming frame didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. I stopped performing, stopped managing, stopped appeasing. I became predictable again, but this time, predictable in strength, not compliance. That predictability reduced tension over time. Tests became less frequent. When they did appear, they were softer, less desperate, more exploratory than confrontational. Consistency was doing what argument never could. I also had to confront something uncomfortable. This process only worked because I was willing to accept the worst outcome. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just realistically. If the relationship ended because I refused to abandon myself, then it wasn't a loss. It was alignment. That mindset changed everything. When you stop negotiating your identity for approval, people either adapt or exit. Both outcomes restore integrity. I could see now how earlier versions of me would have interpreted this shift as coldness, as emotional withdrawal. But it wasn't. I still listened. I still cared. I just didn't surrender authority in the process. Empathy stayed. Submission ended. This is the distinction most men never learn. You can care deeply without compromising your frame. You can be loving without being pliable. You can respect someone's emotions without letting them govern your life. As this dynamic stabilized, something else happened. My resentment faded. Not because I got my way, but because I stopped betraying myself. Resentment only grows where self-abandonment exists. Without that abandonment, there was nothing to resent. The relationship became simpler, not easier, but clearer. Boundaries were visible again. Roles made sense. Direction returned. And with direction came attraction. Not the early volatile kind, the quieter kind. Grounded, observant, real. I understood then why so many relationships fail permanently once authority is lost. Not because it can't be reclaimed, but because most men aren't willing to endure the resistance required to reclaim it. They choose comfort over coherence. They choose peace over respect. They choose approval over leadership. And in doing so, they guarantee the very outcome they fear. What I learned in that phase was irreversible. Power dynamics aren't moral judgments. They're structural realities. Ignore them and they don't disappear. They simply work against you. Once I stopped running from that truth, everything else became simpler. Not easier, but simpler. As the resistance faded, something deeper became visible. The testing had never been about winning arguments. It had been about certainty. Once my behavior became consistent, the questions stopped needing answers. I began to see how every test had followed the same logic. Not conscious, not malicious, structural. Pressure applied to see whether boundaries held. When they collapsed, pressure increased. When they didn't, it moved on. Strength doesn't provoke endless challenge. Weakness does. This was the part most men misunderstand. They assume testing means disrespect. It doesn't. It means uncertainty. And uncertainty demands resolution. When my frame stabilized, her behavior changed without conversation. Fewer emotional spikes, less probing, more observation. She didn't need to push as often because the outcomes had become predictable. Predictability in this context created safety. I also noticed when testing did return, it appeared during moments of stress. Changes at work, family pressure, uncertainty about the future. Those moments triggered something primal, a need to know whether the structure would hold under strain. This made sense. Leadership only matters when conditions are difficult. Anyone can appear strong when nothing is at stake. Pressure reveals reality. I stopped interpreting these moments as personal attacks. I saw them for what they were: verification. That reframing changed my internal response completely. Instead of feeling defensive, I became deliberate, calm, observant. I didn't escalate. I didn't retreat. I held. That was enough. I also began to understand why so many men feel blindsided when relationships fail. They believe things are stable because conflict has decreased. But in reality, conflict often disappears when one person has fully surrendered. Silence isn't peace when it's built on compliance. Real stability includes friction, controlled, contained, purposeful. A relationship without friction isn't harmonious. It's anesthetized. As my frame solidified, the dynamic stopped feeling like a negotiation and started feeling like cooperation again. Not because I conceded, but because my direction was clear enough that cooperation made sense. People don't follow authority they don't trust. Trust comes from consistency. I also saw how badly I had misinterpreted advice I'd heard my entire life. Be understanding, be accommodating, keep the peace. Those ideas aren't wrong. They're incomplete. Understanding without boundaries is self-erasure. Accommodation without authority is submission. Peace without respect is decay. Once I internalized that, everything aligned. I didn't need to assert dominance. I didn't need to remind her who was in charge. Authority doesn't require announcement. It reveals itself through behavior. When I made decisions, I made them. When I listened, I listened. When I said no, it stood. No explanations layered in. No emotional bargaining. That clarity simplified everything. I also noticed how my life outside the relationship had expanded again. I recentered my work, my goals, my standards. Not as a tactic, but as a correction. A relationship cannot be the foundation of a man's life. It must be an extension of it. The moment I rebuilt that foundation, leverage disappeared. Not because she lost power, but because there was nothing left to leverage against me. Independence neutralizes control. This is why the man who needs less controls more. Not because he withholds affection, but because he isn't bargaining with it. That principle clarified everything I had experienced. I had given away authority because I needed reassurance, because I needed harmony, because I needed validation. Those needs created openings. Once they were removed, pressure had nowhere to land. The relationship became quieter, not emotionally empty, but less volatile, less performative. We stopped circling the same arguments, not because they were resolved verbally, but because the structure no longer invited them. And that's the part most men never understand. You don't solve power struggles through discussion. You solve them through consistency. I also became aware of something uncomfortable. The woman who had pushed hardest against my authority earlier seemed calmer now, more settled, less critical. Not because she had won, but because she didn't have to carry the burden of leadership anymore. When a man abdicates authority, someone else must hold it. And holding it over a partner creates resentment, not satisfaction. She didn't want control. She wanted reliability. And reliability comes from someone who doesn't collapse under pressure. This reframed everything I thought I knew about female behavior. The resistance wasn't rebellion, it was evaluation. The anger wasn't hostility, it was stress. The testing wasn't manipulation, it was instinct. Once I saw that, I stopped taking it personally. And when you stop taking tests personally, they lose their power. I also understood why so many men become bitter after relationships end. They believe they were used, that their kindness was exploited, that their sacrifice was unappreciated. The truth is harder. They gave away authority without realizing its value. And once it was gone, nothing else could replace it. Kindness without authority is fragile. It invites consumption rather than respect. Strength without cruelty is the balance most men are never taught to achieve. By the time this phase settled, I knew the relationship would either stabilize permanently or end cleanly. There was no longer room for ambiguity, and that certainty felt like relief. Not because I was guaranteed an outcome, but because I had reclaimed myself. That's what frame ultimately protects, not the relationship, the man inside it. Once the frame was restored, the illusion fell away completely. I could finally see the pattern, not just in my own relationship, but everywhere. Men weren't losing relationships because they were unloving. They were losing them because they surrendered authority and called it compromise. That distinction explains almost every modern relationship failure. I began to notice how often men confuse being needed with being respected. They mistake emotional dependency for connection. They assume that if a woman relies on them emotionally, the bond is strong. In reality, dependency often accelerates decay. Respect requires autonomy. When someone knows you cannot function without them, their perception of you changes. Not consciously, structurally. You move from being a leader to being a liability, someone to manage rather than follow. I had crossed that line without noticing. My emotional stability had become entangled with her approval. Once that happened, the hierarchy was fixed. Restoring frame reversed that, not because I demanded respect, but because I no longer needed reassurance to operate. My choices stood on their own. That independence changed the way she related to me. She listened more carefully. She challenged less often. And when she did challenge, it was exploratory rather than adversarial. The tests hadn't disappeared. They had transformed. Strong leadership doesn't eliminate testing. It reframes it. Tests become lighter, shorter, less frequent. They exist to confirm stability, not to exploit weakness. I also understood why the advice most men receive is so destructive. Happy wife, happy life. It sounds harmless. It sounds wise. But it teaches men to subordinate leadership to emotional management. Once a woman's emotional state becomes the supreme authority in the relationship is already doomed. No one can respect someone whose decisions are dictated by fear of upsetting them. Appeasement creates compliance, not attraction. I could trace the beginning of my own decline to the first time I avoided a decision because I didn't want to deal with her reaction. That moment didn't feel significant at the time. It felt considerate. But leadership dies in moments that feel considerate. I also saw how fear of loss drives nearly all destructive behavior in relationships. The man who is afraid to lose his partner will accept terms he would never accept from anyone else. He will tolerate disrespect. He will explain himself endlessly. he will negotiate his identity. And every concession teaches the same lesson. Pressure works. That lesson doesn't disappear. It compounds. What saved me wasn't becoming indifferent. It was becoming anchored to principles, to direction, to a life that didn't collapse if the relationship ended. That anchoring removed fear, and without fear, power rebalanced naturally. I also recognized something uncomfortable. Many women are miserable not because they lack love, but because they lack someone worth following. They didn't want to become the authority. They were forced into it by male abdication. Leadership is attractive because it removes burden. When a man leads competently, a woman doesn't have to manage him. She can relax into her role without resentment. When a man fails to lead, someone else must. And that someone else rarely enjoys it. This explains why women initiate the majority of breakups. They aren't leaving because they're unhappy with what they're receiving. They're leaving because they're exhausted by what they've been forced to carry. A relationship where a woman manages a man is unsustainable. Not because she is incapable, but because attraction cannot survive reversed polarity. Polarity isn't ideology, it's structure. I began to understand that many men approach relationships like negotiations rather than like leadership roles. They seek agreement rather than alignment. They bargain rather than decide. That approach guarantees endless conflict. Alignment doesn't require constant consensus. It requires trust in direction. When direction is absent, debate fills the vacuum. I also saw why explaining never works. Explanation signals uncertainty. It invites approval. It positions your decisions as proposals rather than conclusions. Leaders don't need consensus to act. They consider input, then decide. The moment I stopped treating my decisions as proposals, resistance diminished. Not because she feared me, because she trusted me. The trust didn't come from promises or reassurance. It came from observing consistency under pressure. I also stopped resenting the tests. I understood their function. They weren't attacks. They were evaluations. And evaluation is unavoidable. Women evaluate strength because strength determines security. A man who crumbles under emotional pressure will crumble under real threats. Biology doesn't negotiate that logic. Understanding this removed bitterness completely. I wasn't being sabotaged. I was being assessed. And assessment continues as long as uncertainty exists. The man who passes these evaluations doesn't need to demand loyalty. He earns it. The man who fails them doesn't lose because he wasn't loved enough. He loses because he wasn't grounded enough to be trusted with leadership. This perspective changed how I viewed every interaction. Conflict became information. Resistance became feedback. Silence became signal. Nothing was random anymore. I also realized that most men don't lose relationships suddenly. They lose them gradually, then act surprised at the end. The woman doesn't wake up one day and leave. She detaches slowly as respect erodes. By the time she leaves, the decision was made long ago. Frame collapse is slow. Recovery is not. Either you re-establish authority or the relationship decays quietly until exit becomes inevitable. There is no middle ground. This clarity wasn't comforting, but it was freeing. Because once you understand the structure, you stop taking the outcomes personally. You either lead or you don't, and relationships respond accordingly. The hardest lesson I had to learn wasn't about women or relationships. It was about myself, about how easy it is to abandon your own center in exchange for comfort, about how quietly a man can trade his integrity for peace and call it love. Life doesn't punish men for being cruel. It punishes men for being unclear, for not knowing what they stand for building their identity around approval instead of principle. The same pattern that destroys relationships, destroys careers, friendships, and self-respect. The moment you let fear dictate your choices, someone else will step in and decide for you. Strength isn't loud, it isn't aggressive. It's the ability to stay aligned with yourself when doing so creates tension. It's the willingness to disappoint people you care about rather than betray the person you have to live with every day. Real confidence isn't feeling good all the time. It's being stable when things don't feel good. If there's one thing to take from this story, it's this: your life must have a structure that exists independently of anyone's approval. Relationships should add depth to that structure, not replace it. Love grows where respect is possible, and respect only exists where boundaries are real. If any part of this resonated with you, leave a comment and share where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read them. And if you value conversations that go deeper than surface advice, consider subscribing. Quietly, intentionally.